What is up guys, Blue Spooky here with a 2-hour Megamix. That is 2 hours of new true scary stories to this channel, as much as I'm able to track. If you guys enjoy this long video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. Doing all of those ensures I can keep making daily videos for a long time to come, especially these longer ones. If you guys have any thoughts about the stories in this video, please be sure to leave them in the comments below, as one of my favorite parts about doing this is reading your guys' comments, even if I don't always get the chance to reply to them. Without further ado though guys, I will let you enjoy the next 2 hours of true scary stories, and I will see you again at the end of the video. Thanks for watching. I live in a pretty rural area, and my school bus used to come at the end of the drive I lived on at 7 a.m. every morning. It returned at 3 p.m. every afternoon to drop me off from school. The drive was a dirt road with a lot of bumps, rocks, and branching pathways the further you went, so rather than drive each individual kid to their stop, the bus would kind of just let us off at the start of the drive. From there, we would all have to walk. It wasn't that far, but on a blazing hot or freezing cold day, or during a heavy rainstorm, it was certainly far enough. I realize that I'm describing the walk as a negative experience already, but the truth is, it's not the walk itself that was that bad. It was an experience I had with one of the people that waited for us at the end of the school day that I want to talk about. Most days, the parents of the younger kids would walk with us until we got home. I'd known a lot of these people my whole life, so I trusted them all completely. I mostly stuck to talking with my immediate next-door neighbors, a nice couple in their mid-40s. There were days they weren't there though, because their daughter was out of school. On those, I'd kind of keep to myself. I was a pretty quiet kid anyway, so that's not really surprising. One day, I noticed someone new at our bus stop, or rather, two someones really. A 5-year-old kid and an older boy. The older boy said that his brother had just turned 5 and was entering school for the very first time. Being raised to be polite, I shook the elder brother's hand and introduced myself, not really thinking anything of it. Over the next year, my last year of middle school, he would talk to me more and more at the end of each day. He was usually hunched over, yet at the same time he somehow towered over me with his lanky frame. I learned quite a lot about him. He was 19 and had dropped out of school a few years ago. He lived with a single mom and his younger brother. He also told me he liked to take walks in the afternoons. Usually, I'd just absorb his little information snippets and go on my way, after saying that was nice or that's cool or something like that. One day, he began asking me if I would like to go for a walk with him sometime. Now, my parents are pretty overprotective since I was their only kid. I knew they wouldn't let me go on a walk with some older boy alone without meeting him first, so I told him that. He seemed very disappointed, but took it well. At least the first few times. I would be lying if I said I wasn't tempted to say yes, in part or mostly because I was curious, but a deeper part of me kept urging me to say no. It wasn't a panicked feeling or anything, more of a gut feeling that something was off about this guy, and I'm very glad I listened to it. I kept on saying I still hadn't asked my parents yet, and he would keep asking and asking. Many times getting very insistent before backing off when he had to go up his part of the drive. Thankfully, he lived in a different pocket on the road, so he didn't know where I lived. At least I hoped so. It all came to a head on the last few days of school. It was a cloudy day, and when I got on the bus to head home, I noticed that my immediate neighbor's daughter was not on it, and neither was my new bus stop buddy's brother either. I figured it would be a quiet walk for me that day, and I felt a bit of relief knowing he wouldn't be there or asking me to go with him all day long. I would finally get a reprieve from that bubble of anxiety in my belly whenever I saw him waiting for us. The second the bus came to a squeaking stop on my road, though, my stomach panged with apprehension. He was waiting there all alone, wearing the same blue hoodie and holding the same expression as usual, a patient smile. His hands were clasped behind his back. I tried not to make eye contact through the window, and I thought to myself, okay, let's do this. It's probably fine. He'll just ask me to go for a walk, I'll say no, and that'll be it, right? Wrong. Why was he even here in the first place? I wanted to ask him why, but I thought my first action should be to try and act normal. The conversation started off like usual at first. You know, how was school and things like that. He looked more hesitant than usual, though. We're going to be moving soon. I won't get to see you or go for that walk anytime soon. Oh, that was my only response. I couldn't think of what else to say. On some level, I was relieved I wouldn't have to see him anymore. On the other hand, I felt sad for his little brother. The brother was a sweet kid, and it couldn't have been easy moving after only 1 year of kindergarten. In retrospect, this next part might not sound very creepy and maybe anticlimactic, but I have to remind you of the facts here. This was a nearly 20-year-old man talking to a barely 13-year-old girl. As he turned onto his road to go home, he turned around and fixed me with the most intense stare I'd ever seen. "I like you," he whispered to me. "As a friend, right?" I laughed and prayed that that was it. He smiled as if I'd just told him the funniest joke he's heard in years. One day it'll be different. Now, a lot of you will question why I didn't just book it to the nearest phone to call my parents, but I was too surprised and confused to do anything in the moment. As he started to take a step towards me, I was already speed walking away down my bend in the road. I wondered if that really all happened or if I'd just imagined the whole thing. In the end, I had to accept that it really did. I never got a follow-up on this because I never saw him again, and if I did now, I doubt I would even recognize him. I don't know what he had planned for me or on that walk, or what his intentions were, if anything. But based on what he said and the gut feelings of my younger self, I'm guessing I really didn't want to find out. My neighborhood loved Halloween, almost revered it like a second Christmas or something, or a first spooky Christmas. I'm not really sure. What I do know, though, is that when the first leaves started to fall and the air became crisp and cold, everyone's decorations began to emerge from their sheds or boxes or dusty garages. Skeletons, cardboard cutout witches, black cat piñatas, the ever-important jack-o'-lanterns, you name it. Every house had something. Some chose to be more elaborate than others, though, while some just had a Happy Halloween banner and a pumpkin on their front door. Others chose themes to completely transform their yard with. The neighbors to the left were particularly good at a haunted graveyard scene, with animatronic hands popping out of the ground and moving whenever people walked by. It was freaky, I'll admit, especially at night. On Halloween, they would set out a big fog machine, so trick-or-treaters couldn't see the scares until they were right on them. To be honest, I really liked it and found it quite charming. One house across the street, though, would prepare for Halloween in a different kind of way. None of us really knew them at all, but I would see them every once in a while. An older man and his son who was in his mid-20s. The man was graying and looked on the verge of needing a walker already. The son was, for lack of a better term, very scruffy looking. He still seemed to be able to handle the heavy lifting of moving boxes of decorations out onto the lawn every day, though. Their idea of spooky Halloween decorations was a common topic among my parents at the dinner table, as well as the local kids. Mostly because of how legitimately creepy they looked. This wasn't an over-the-top kind of creepy either. They were pretty damn realistic. Sometimes they would paint a massacre scene, with mannequins painted to look like real people and blood splattered all over the yard. Other times it would be a realistic mad scientist torture scene. which featured the man and the son himself, the former of which would be strapped to a table. He would pretend to go at him with needles and other devices. We all figured they just had a really fucked up sense of humor, but I could tell it made my parents a little uncomfortable for my sister or I to go over there to trick or treat on Halloween. So it was that we avoided that house altogether. That was until my sister became a total brat one Halloween and insisted we go and see what was up with them. Her name was Dorothy, and she was going to have her curiosity satiated no matter what. Being the responsible older sister, I had to keep up with her to make sure she didn't get herself hurt or get into too much trouble. So, when the big night came, we got ready. I was a generic black cat, and she was a little diva witch with a plastic broom and magic wand. We hashed out the plan. We would do our normal trick-or-treating routine, then loop back around to knock on the across-the-street neighbor's back door and conduct a little interview, of course. We'd pick their brains for why their Halloween decorations were so disturbing, and off we set. She ran around shrieking witchy curses at her friends, with me trailing behind and keeping an eye on everyone. I remember I had a stash of Butterfingers in my sweatshirt pocket and was dutifully crunching on them throughout the trip. She negotiated her candy stash with the others. Soon enough, though, her little friends dropped off to go home, and we were facing the neighbor's backyard. It was small, with scraggly grass that led up to a door with chipped paint. I know, the stereotypical run-down house with a crazy person living inside. But I kid you not when I tell you that's exactly what it looked like. My sister was the brave one here. She marched right up to the door and banged on it loudly, screaming, "Trick or treat!" We waited for a few minutes, each one of us getting more uncomfortable than the last. A thin layer of frost was across the grass. I knew my sister would be getting cold soon. I could see her excited breaths misting in the air as we waited. Just as I was about to give up, the door opened with a jolt. It was the younger man, and his eyes went wide when he saw us. He scrambled up to us, and I instinctively reached out to pull my sister back away from him. He surprised us, though, when he said, "You shouldn't be here, seriously. My dad doesn't like kids or people trespassing. You should really go, right now." "But we wanted to know why your yard is so scary," my sister whined. "It's to keep people out," he said hastily, gesturing with his hands. He seemed genuinely afraid for us and for himself. "He doesn't think straight when he's drunk, so you have to go right now." A voice came from somewhere behind him inside. It sounded slurred and heavy. "Bobby, who's there?" The son went as far as to push me and my sister out of the backyard, hissing through his teeth, "You gotta get out of here." Seeing as we had no other option, we left immediately. My sister was still pressed to know what was going on, but even she seemed nervous now. I was definitely nervous. Just to be safe, I had us go around the block and come down the street again, as if we were coming home like normal. As we entered the front door, I looked back at the house, looking for any sign of Bobby or his father. There was nothing. I know a lot of you might be looking for a story with lots of action, but I can only really speculate what was going on in that house may have been worse than any scary story. Since we didn't get to see inside, we'll never know for sure, though. Okay guys, so before this story starts, I just want to let you guys know it has elements of essay and rape in it, so please skip this one if you're not comfortable with that sort of thing. And with that being said, I will now get on to the story. This isn't my story, but instead it's my mother's. She passed away in 2016 from cancer, but before she did, she took it upon herself to unload any regrets from her past or any mysteries I might have questioned about her. She wanted there to be no secrets between us in the end, and I admire her greatly for that. She requested that I tell her story to others, to warn people about the dangers of trusting people you barely know too blindly, as even if they seem to integrate into your life with the best of intentions, it can merely be a facade for something much, much darker. I'll try to relay everything she told me to the best of my ability, though due to the emotional nature of our last few conversations, I may not remember the details too clearly. For some context, I was adopted by her and her husband when I was only 2 months old. Even though they aren't my birth parents technically, they are the only mother and father I've ever known, and they'll be such until the day I die. That's not where this story started though. The story starts a few years after I was adopted. I was adjusting really well apparently. My mother and father both adored me, and even though they both had busy careers, they never slacked in showing me the time of day. My mother was working as a home remodeler at the time, while my dad worked in sales. For the time, they made a very good living. My mom was beginning to feel a bit overwhelmed by everything though. She ran her business right from home, and the influx of new clients coming in was stressing her out really bad. She decided to hire on some extra help. She wasn't having much luck until a neighbor by the name of John applied. Now, John had lived on our street for about as long as my parents had, but they'd never really gotten a chance to know each other that well. It came as a bit of a surprise that John was willing to work under my mother, as according to my dad, he was the type to make derogatory comments at the local bar with friends about women. Ultimately though, he was nothing but respectful in front of my mother, for the first couple of months at least. Whenever they went out on a job after the first month or two, John would start making sexist comments to my mom, sometimes even in front of clients. He would present himself as the head of the operation, not her, and when she tried to correct him, he would laugh it off like he was just making a joke. She got very annoyed with him and gave him a stern warning to knock it off or he'd be fired immediately. She then said he started making other kinds of comments instead. He would tell her she looked pretty today, or that the way she walked showed off her toolbox. You get the idea. This made her incredibly uncomfortable. She said she was going to let him go right then and there after he made a gross comment about her blouse within earshot of a client. Due to an influx of business though, she unfortunately couldn't afford to let him go. She could always let him go after the surge of business when things calmed down, she told herself, and just put up with him until then. It was at this point in the conversation that she started crying. I got her a tissue and some water and told her to save her strength, but she protested, saying she needed to get all this out. Even if it was painful or wiped her out for a couple of days, she needed to tell me. She continued even as I noted her heart monitor beside her speeding up rapidly. She told me she was wrong in thinking she could just handle it on her own. She thought that since she was a professional and this was an actual business, she was untouchable and he wouldn't or couldn't do anything to her. She didn't even tell my father, and as far as I knew, they told each other everything. The last thing she wanted was to have him worried about her and not focusing at work or being too worked up to spend time with me. A lot of people might condemn her actions or think ill of her, but I choose to understand it by remembering a simple fact. When people are faced with something they don't know how to handle, they won't always react in the perfect way. They'll react out of stress or fear. My mother found out just how wrong she was though, when her and John got a new job to fix up a vacant house at the end of our street. The new owner had bought it with the intention of turning it into a daycare and wanted them to paint and spruce up the place. The owner said they would furnish it themselves. They would be gone for the duration of the cleanup, on the note that they didn't want to get in the way, and that made my mother hesitant. Up until this point, she'd never been alone with John when working on a job before. She also wasn't one to pass up an opportunity though, so reluctantly she and John made their way to the abandoned house at the end of the street. They unloaded the necessary paint supplies from her pickup truck and headed inside. The first thing she noticed was that the house was drafty and dark. Very little light shone in through the windows, and the layout made it cramped and unappealing for a daycare setup. She went in to inspect the kitchen first, with John following behind her. She was about to suggest they tear out the wall to open up the breakfast bar, when suddenly he grabbed her hard and pushed her against the wall. She screamed and fought all the while, but she couldn't stop something really awful from happening to her. Something I won't name here, but I'm sure you can figure out what it is. After he was done with her, he told her not to tell anyone because he would ruin her business and tell my father that she'd been cheating on him. Even come after her again or me. John was a monster, and my mom was so scared he'd make good on his threats that she couldn't do anything other than comply. John distanced himself from my mother's business soon after, but she could tell he was keeping tabs on who knew what. She felt horrible not being able to tell my father and had to deal with what happened completely on her own. She became more withdrawn after that. She still showed love for us, of course, but it was more strained, and it was harder to get her outside to do the things she loved. We cried in each other's arms after she was finished. I felt sick, while she looked as if she'd been reliving every horrible moment. At this point, I can only say I'm glad my mother is finally at peace. Nothing will ever trouble her again, and monsters like John will never be able to reach her. If there's anything you can take away from my mother's story, it's this: be careful who you let in. When I was 13, I was completely in love with the girl next door. Her name was Catherine, and she also happened to be my best friend. We would spend the night at each other's houses as kids all the time. Watch movies, paint our nails. It was in my first year of high school that I started to feel differently about her. Don't get me wrong, I'd always loved her, of course, but it started to feel more intense. I started thinking about her more often, and every time I saw her, I would notice more and more how pretty she was. She had bright blue eyes and dirty blonde hair, and her smile caused my heart to skip a beat. I was so scared to confess to her, though. For one thing, I didn't know if she felt the same way or if she was gay at all. The topic just never came up, as we were too busy fangirling over bands we liked or new movies coming out. The last thing I wanted to do was mess up our lifelong friendship at that point. However, the second problem was bigger and more concerning. We lived in a really conservative area that still held on to those traditional values. I knew that going public, especially at the time with my feelings, would be at the very least frowned upon. So, for the longest time, I hid in the shadows while being by her side every day through high school. We still hung out every weekend and after school a few times a week, driving through town and telling each other all our secrets. We still shared a blanket on movie night, though now my heart would leap whenever she threw her arms around me because of a big jump scare or romantic moment. She really trusted me completely with her biggest fears and worries, and so did I with her, minus that one really big thing. As graduation was rapidly approaching, and the air was growing warmer with each passing day, I noticed that her affection toward me had been heating up too. I don't know if it was just my imagination running wild, but she began to hug me for a lot longer and told me I was pretty a lot more often too. On the night of our senior prom, I took her aside. We'd gone with a group of friends, so there were no dates involved. I worked up the courage and stole a kiss. To my disbelief and happiness, she simply said, "I was waiting for you to do that, you know." We started a secret relationship from that night on. We still kept our usual dynamic with movie nights and boy bands and whatever hobbies we had, but without going into detail, I didn't think I could be happier. I loved her and she loved me. We knew we'd go to the same college together, and I honestly couldn't wait to get out of this town. I know it sounds like naive and wishful thinking, but I honestly thought I was going to marry Catherine someday. One day in late August, though, a couple of weeks before we were set to pack for school, Catherine just stopped talking to me. I couldn't reach her on cell, and whenever I called her house, her dad would always answer and say something along the lines of, "Oh, Catherine is out right now. I'll have her call you back later." Her window faced mine on the side of the house, so after the second day of her not calling me back, I knew that something was wrong. I tried to get a peek in her window to see if she was there, but the curtains were drawn shut and her bedroom light was turned off as well. She usually kept her light on until midnight, as she was a night owl. By that point, I was starting to get really worried. I started searching every place I knew she could be. The candy shop, the lake, all the country roads leading out into the woods. I asked her coworkers at the local Hannaford if they'd seen her recently, and they all shook her head no. She hadn't shown up for work 3 days in a row, and that certainly was not like her. Catherine was hardworking, driven, and always called if she was going to be late or wasn't coming in. She'd always call me, too. That was when I finally broke down. I went to knock on her door, determined to find out what was going on. I stood on the front stoop, my shoulders slumped and eyes pricking with tears. My entire body was tense and wired, as if I hadn't slept in a week. I was about ready to burst through the doorway when she answered, and hug her and ask her where the hell she'd been, if she answered. And so I knocked. Her dad opened the door, looking as if he'd just been in the middle of a nap. Catherine's dad had always been a little indifferent to me, never really talking to me whenever I came over, or when he had to pick her and I up from school. Today, I could see a scowl of disgust plainly on his face. He regarded me coldly. Hello, is Kat here? I'm really worried about her and I need to talk to her." "I told you she was out," he snapped immediately. "And you need to stay away from her. I know all about your little love letters." What he said made my heart completely stop. How did he know about those? I'd written these letters a month into our relationship that detailed how long I was in love with her. She hid them deep inside her dresser. He'd gotten them somehow. He must have done something to her. Kicked her out of the house or worse. Maybe she ran away. I gasped and couldn't speak, but he did. "She's gone. You won't see my daughter again, so don't even try." With those final crushing words, he slammed the door in my face. I jumped back, almost falling down. My hands were shaking. I was in disbelief. Resigned and with tears streaming down my face, I went home to face the disappointment of my parents. Apparently, her dad had also let them know what was going on all along. I never saw Catherine again. My best friend, the girl I grew up with and my first love, disappeared from my life forever. I did, however, eventually find out what happened to her from sources I won't name. After her father snooped through her room and found my letters, he snapped. He locked her in her room that night, where she stayed for 2 days while he arranged a ride from a friend to take her to someplace where they would cure her affliction. I'm disgusted to even think about what that means, and what she went through. I'm out of my oppressive hometown, and married to a wonderful woman now. Some part of me always still breaks, though, whenever Catherine crosses my mind. I hope she's okay wherever she is, and even if we can't be in love anymore, I still want my best friend, the girl next door, back. She never did anything wrong. She never deserved what happened to her. I'm a female. I was 25 at the time this happened. This was in 2018, and I lived with my boyfriend in our hometown. It's a small city that's relatively poor and has some drug problems as well, since there's not much to do. My boyfriend, now husband, was at his friend's house. It was a Saturday night, and he said he'd be home around 9 or so. He was about 2 towns over, a 20-minute drive away. At the time, we lived in a duplex with a split upstairs and downstairs. It used to be one big house, but had since been converted. My cousin was actually renting the downstairs apartment, and she was kind of loud. Because of this, I knew when she was and wasn't home, and she was not home on this night. The way our street was situated, the backs of the houses on my street and the parallel street all faced a narrow alley, and the driveways were mostly only accessible this way. The downstairs unit had a front porch with a door and a side door. Our upstairs unit had a back door at the top of an outside set of wooden stairs. So anyway, I'm home watching TV alone. when I hear someone coming up the stairs and knocking on the door. It was about 8:30. It wouldn't be that unusual for my boyfriend to be home early. Maybe he'd gotten bored playing video games, or he just felt like leaving for whatever reason. Usually, I would unlock the door for him when he came home, instead of him using his keys. It was quite dark back there and could be a real hassle. I got up and opened the door like usual, only to find someone who was not my boyfriend. It was a pretty thin man, wearing 2 big jeans and a hoodie. He had about 4 teeth and was teetering back and forth. I was so shocked. I was positive that had been my boyfriend coming home. The guy at the door asked me, "Can I use your phone?" Behind him, down the stairs and in the alleyway, I saw a big SUV just idling, with other people clearly inside. I panicked and said, "Yeah, hold on." I shut the door in his face and locked it. I think I was more shocked that it was a stranger at my door and not my boyfriend than anything else. I hid so he couldn't see me through the door's window, and I was frozen now. Something was telling me this was not okay. After a few minutes, I heard him run down the stairs. I go over to the door and see the car driving away in a hurry down the alley. I called my boyfriend and told him what happened. He said he'd leave, but like I said, it was a 20-minute drive. He had been just about to leave anyway. After he got home, I calmed down and felt a bit silly. Why not just lend the guy my phone? Was it really that weird? Then I thought about it a bit more over the next few days, though. It was 2018. This guy and whoever was in the car waiting for him, none of them had a phone? It wasn't like they were having car trouble either. What would they need a stranger's phone for? To even get to my home, they had to go down a random alley to the back side of a house, go up some random stairs and knock on someone's door just to ask for a phone. They didn't go to my cousin's front door downstairs either. I would have heard someone out there on the porch. They didn't go to any other house. I saw them leave the street entirely. Why go to a house to ask for a phone when there was no car in the driveway? Of course, as tends to be my luck, our battery-powered security camera was dead at the time. I'm genuinely not sure what they wanted. If anyone has any ideas, please let me know. I'm sure they didn't want anything good, though. When I was about 13, my parents and I took a trip to Yellowstone National Park. We were out hiking on a trail when we suddenly heard a huge crash and loud screaming. "Watch out!" Those were the only words yelled out from someone not in sight, on the trail just up ahead. All of a sudden, hundreds of buffalo appeared, crashing through the trees coming right towards us. Executing our natural flight response to this dismal turn of events, we ran as fast as we could through the woods. I even tripped at one point. I remember screaming out to my mother desperately, who was already there to help me out. My father yelled at us to follow him as we started running up the hill on the other side of the path. Not even moments later, the herd of buffalo rushed right past where we'd just been. It turns out if you're ever being chased by a gigantic herd, you should always run uphill because the herd tends to naturally go downhill. Luckily, none of us were seriously harmed. We went to a diner right after that for lunch, and I ordered a buffalo burger. Gave me a real sense of victory. Camping in general can be pretty freaky. Not so much during the day, but when it gets dark, it gets real dark. Whenever people say the Blair Witch Project wasn't scary, I always ask them if they've ever been camping for real. If you have, then that movie probably freaks you the fuck out. Laying in your tent at night not knowing what's 3 feet away from you is terrifying. It's pitch black and quiet. It's like being alone in a creaky old house, except with a 10 times multiplier. Every sound could be a bear, a wolf, or a person out to get you. If you're in a tent, you can't see what's going on. Probably my freakiest experience happened when I was a kid. We went camping in Colorado. It was dark, but still too early for us to be tired. We were all sitting around the fire doing the do, talking, eating s'mores, whatever. I would say we were telling scary stories, but fuck that. We were probably talking about Disney movies or some other dumb shit. Now, keep in mind how dark it is out there. The light from the fire only goes out so far, and it creates like this black wall where all the light just stops altogether. We were sitting there when all of a sudden my sister looked up and got rigid. I looked over and saw a pair of eyes staring at us from the darkness. Me and my sister started freaking out. We were right on the edge of losing our minds scared. Our parents calmed us down though and told us not to move. We had no idea what it was, and it was nearly impossible to judge how big in the darkness. We sat there and watched those eyes until eventually they went away. Maybe it was a raccoon or some shit, but 6-year-old me was convinced it was the chupacabra. Maybe not as interesting as some other stories, but it definitely freaked us out. My dad admits to this day that he was not scared, but notoriously he's never been able to handle anything scary on any level, so I really call bullshit on that. My mom's worked in medical records in a general hospital for over 20 years now. She's bright, personable, and professional. What I'm saying here is that there's not much that phases her anymore. Even at the dinner table, though she doesn't reveal any personal info about any charts or anything, she just tells enough to make everyone lose their appetites. She had one incident a couple of years ago, though, that actually rattled her quite badly, and she took a while to open up to me and my dad about it. Actually, it rattled a lot of people in her department, maybe even the entire floor, because it wasn't exactly an isolated experience. My mom's office was located on the second floor of the hospital. In one corner, it had a locked door with a code to get in for security purposes. It also had big glass windows, providing a view inside. It wasn't exactly soundproof though, and that's where the meat of this story comes in. I won't bother you with random details about the regular workday, but my mom said she was sitting at her desk as usual when suddenly a quite unusual sound tore throughout the area. It was muted, faint at first, and nobody could tell what it was. My mom paused in her work, as did so many others. Without the mismatched clacking of keyboards, the office was eerily quiet. It seemed like everybody held their breath, waiting for the sound to come again. And it did. Oh boy, did it. A clear guttural scream tore through the office space and down the hall. It sounded like an elderly woman in excruciating pain. But something was off here. Well, obviously something was off that a woman was screaming in the first place, but for other reasons than what you might think. For one, my mom said it was louder than any human could feasibly make a sound. For another, there were no patients allowed on this floor. And for a final thing, it seemed to be echoing. It was coming from the floor's elevator. Security was quickly called to the elevator for a short time. My mom said it was hard to concentrate, knowing somebody might have had something bad happen to them. Maybe they were stuck in the elevator shaft or had been crushed or something. She couldn't imagine how anyone could survive that, let alone an old woman. But still, she found herself going through the motions without really putting any thought into them. She said she felt numb, like all her mental energy was just drained away or sucked into finding out what happened. Punchline is, they didn't find anything. The hospital security searched the entire floor, elevator, and personnel top to bottom. There was no trace of an injured elderly woman. I know the story sounds a bit far-fetched, but to this day my mom is adamant about what happened, and there are many other witnesses as well. Maybe it was an elevator malfunction, or a mass hallucination. Maybe something even more chilling like a ghost or something. I guess we'll never really know. Here's a story, not from my mom, but from my mom's coworker in medical records. There's a lot of scary things that happen in hospitals, but this experience was a different kind of scary altogether. According to my mom's coworker, who was more like her friend really, the day started out like any other. It was a regular Tuesday, and as busy in the main office as it was, she still had to go to the storage building to retrieve and file away records from time to time. Back when this happened, they still kept physical copies as opposed to digital. My mom said it was a real hassle adjusting a few years later, but that's a story for another time. The storage building was located absurdly far from the main hospital. In fact, it was a tiny, partially underground warehouse, for lack of a better term. It sat all the way across the parking lot, situated at the edge of a thick stretch of woods. My mom's coworker had been charged with the task of grabbing a stack of records from the building, as many of it as she could feasibly carry at least. Since it was broad daylight, she had no problem walking so far from the main office alone, and figured the job would be a quick in and out. A lot of people didn't like that building in their office, but it was a necessary part of the job, so they put up with it. For one, my mom always described the inside of that building as very creepy. Low-hanging ceilings, a staircase descending downward into darkness, very weak and low lighting. Basically, it looked like a space you would see in the subreddit liminal horror, if you get my drift. Just rows and rows of narrow, empty hallways that could really mess with your mind. Anyway, my mom's coworker carefully took the steps one by one as the mouth of the storage unit gaped before her. There was a dim orange glow illuminating from the depths, and the stale paper smell wafted out from deeper in. She got to the section she was supposed to go to and started grabbing up yellow folders from the shelf. Suddenly, she heard footsteps echoing from somewhere in the aisles. She thought maybe another coworker had been charged with record sorting as well, but that theory was quickly squashed back when the footsteps quickened their pace. They sounded like they were running back and forth down the aisles and definitely getting closer to her. She froze, listening, even as her fight or flight reflex screamed at her to do something. Eventually, the footsteps sounded like they were racing down the aisle next to hers, about to turn the corner and come after her. That's when she finally took off. She doesn't remember if she made any noise or if she was followed, but she tore up those steps without looking back once. She said to my mom that she'd never been so grateful for the sun blinding her before. The blood rushed to her ears as she ran across the parking lot and back into the building. When she told their supervisor what happened, they confirmed there was no one else in the building aside from her at that time. At least none that they knew about. Since then, everyone was hesitant to go down there alone, and they requested a buddy system for sorting or retrieving records, especially during the night shift. The building was eventually abandoned anyway, due to the shift to digital records I mentioned earlier, but it still sits there. No one knows who or what was in the building that day, or if they meant my mom's coworker any harm. We do know it was creepy as hell though, and I know I'm not going to any job that has a weird off-site storage building anytime soon. I'm a 29-year-old female. Call me Mary. I worked in a mental health and psychiatric ward in a hospital for about 7 years before I resigned last year. It can be really grueling, but it's ultimately rewarding work. I mostly conduct individualized therapy for inpatients who don't respond to outpatient or group therapy well. I advocate for their needs, and am able to make real connections with people who sometimes just need some extra support. It's really opened my eyes to the scope of the human condition. Forgive me if that sounds a bit pretentious, and what others' lives are like besides my own. Every once in a while, though, I get someone in my ward that I don't have the qualifications to treat. Not for lack of trying, mind you. Sometimes they just don't click with anyone in our facility. And that's just the state of things. You just do the best you can to help them adjust until they find someone they can open up to. There was one patient who transferred into my care, though, that I genuinely grew to fear despite my efforts to keep up an empathetic professional front. Barring names, the patient was transferred to the mental health ward during my last year there. He was in his 30s and really thin. According to his primary doctors, he had stopped eating because he was convinced his wife of 5 years was trying to poison him. He began to get belligerent and borderline violent with the wife, swearing at her if he thought she was behaving suspiciously. At first, he was admitted to the ICU because of his poor health, but after a few weeks, he got approval for referral upstairs to psychiatric. That's where I came in. Our first few sessions, I would do most of the talking. He was very quiet and withdrawn, but he seemed to acknowledge that maybe he was wrong about his wife, which was a start to me. I asked him why he thought his wife was trying to poison him in the first place. He said the suspicion had started when she went out of the room to pour him a drink rather than just bringing the bottle right in. He said she had told him the bottle was almost out anyway, and she saw no point in bringing it all the way over only to immediately throw it away. But he didn't believe her. He gradually opened up a bit more from there. He said they'd been having some problems prior to his beliefs. They had separated for a few months before the first incident, and he often described her as looking at him with what he described as bitchy contempt. Like she was pissed at him, but he didn't even know what he'd done wrong. I thought we were making some good progress. I reminded him that each incident of his wife trying to poison him had a rational explanation, and let him work out the reasons for himself with some gentle guidance. That was when the first accusation came up. He sat across from me in my client chair one day. There was a desk between us, and I felt good knowing there was some sort of barrier there. He suddenly grew quiet in a moment where we were talking about another incident with his wife, something involving his birthday cake. He sternly said, "Are you with that bitch?" "Excuse me?" I said out of reflex. Every bit of conflict training rushed through my head as I recomposed myself. I cleared my throat. "I apologize, but what exactly do you mean by that?" I could see the veins bulging out of his neck as he narrowed his eyes at me. His voice was low and nearly a growl now. "You're with that bitch, aren't you? My wife. You're trying to get in my head so next time I'll eat what she gives me, right? Don't deny it." "I don't know your wife," I said gently. "Now, how about we take a moment," and he suddenly slammed his fist down on the desk. No! You're trying to poison me too! Don't talk to me!" He seemed like a completely different person from when I met him. He started spitting and swearing, leading security to be called in. They had to sedate him to take him back to his room. All the while, I was pushed back against the window to my own office, unable to move and completely rattled. My hand shook as he was dragged out of the room. I felt like I was in the sights of someone who genuinely wanted to hurt me or possibly kill me. Although he didn't get the opportunity to physically harm me, I was pretty sure he really wanted to. He'd been supplied with nutrient supplements that had returned him to his former strength, and I'm very small, so he would have had no problem tossing me around the room like a rag doll if he wanted to. I was offered the rest of the day off, which I gratefully took to process these events. I needed a fresh mind to come back the next day and work with other patients. I didn't know how I would deal with this guy going forward, especially if he felt he couldn't trust me anymore. But I decided to cross that bridge when I came to it. The next day, the patient was brought in. He wanted to apologize and said his wife had baked me a cake for taking care of him. Now, I'm not allowed to accept any food items from patients or outside family members, so I said I was grateful, but I had to politely decline. He immediately became irate, asking in an angry tone, "Why won't you eat it, huh?" This caught me off guard. For one, he was being treated for a possible delusion that his wife was trying to poison him. For two, it was strange he trusted his wife with any sort of food at this stage. For three, he'd just accused me the day prior of working with his wife to try and kill him too. So this sudden turnaround was very startling. He became very insistent. "Just eat the fucking cake," he said over and over, to the point where security had to be called again to escort him out. He was released from my care soon after, for fear of my safety. I don't know what's happened to him since. My boss and a police officer called to the scene suspected that he'd put something into the cake his wife had given him, either to support his delusion or to specifically target me. Which possibility is correct, I'll never know. I resigned a few weeks later for a different, less stressful career option. To anyone who works in psychiatric, be real careful out there. I was at a lake in the woods fishing with my 4-year-old kid and wife. There was nobody there except for us. The lake was surrounded by a dense forest of trees, brush, and the like. We were about 50 yards from our vehicle, down a hill at the bank with our poles resting in the water. The fishing was slow, so I decided to test out my new camera. I walked around the general area, while my wife sat with our child and tended to the fishing poles. I walked up a hill from the bank and through the dense trees to the mouth of a clearing, where all of a sudden, I saw 4 random guys, approximately 20 yards away out there in the woods. They looked like a cross between grunge band members and deep woods hillbillies. I don't know really. They were dirty and unwashed, looking kind of raggedy. We were in the boondocks, so I had no idea what these guys were randomly doing here. They just stood there looking at me for what seemed like a good solid 2 or 3 minutes. The look in their eyes was either desperation for some reason or malevolent intentions. I played it off and focused my camera in a different direction. I noticed that one of them was moving closer to where I was. I immediately felt really uneasy. I mean, why the hell were these guys out here so far in the middle of nowhere, with no fishing poles, no hiking gear, nothing? The one that had moved closer to where I was called out of the blue, "Hey, why don't you come and take our picture?" He then kind of half giggled, revealing his rotted-looking mouth. He had about as much teeth as a jack-o'-lantern. I'm not trying to be judgmental. These guys were just very sketchy. I could definitely feel this one's intentions in particular were nothing good. I smiled back and kind of nodded. I started making my way back to my family and the fishing spot. As I started walking away, I heard one of the ones further away holler at me. "Hey man, come over here. We want you to take our picture." I heard the others laughing, and I noticed they were slowly making their way towards my direction. They were talking amongst themselves and laughing sinisterly, as if they were villains out of a horror movie or something. I couldn't make out what they were saying at this point. I was casually but quickly leaving the area. I did make out a few comments though, like, "Yeah, I think he's alone." "Nah, I saw his car over that way." Anyway, I finally made it back down to the bank and immediately told my wife to start gathering our shit and head back to the car. She could tell by the sound of my voice and demeanor that something was wrong here. We both half-heartedly packed up, grabbed the kid, and headed up the bank to where our vehicle was at. Still the only other people out there. Right as we got to the car, I noticed they were in the distance coming out of the woods and charging right towards us. We threw our shit in the back, jumped in the car, and started heading out. I didn't want to worry my wife, but I had the realization that there was only one way out of there. An old dirt road that meandered through the woods and passed right by where they were at. I was afraid we might get cut off, so I floored it and thought I was going to stop for nothing. As we were making our way out, I saw something to the right out of my peripheral vision. Sure enough, it was one of them full stride running towards us. This time, I noticed he had something in his right hand that looked like an elongated tire iron or something. We lost him in the woods just about as they made it to the road. A while later, maybe 30 minutes, we made to the old country concrete highway that led back to the city. At this point, we saw another vehicle in the distance coming in our direction, a beat-up old work truck. I thought to myself, "Oh, fucking shit, they caught up to us." Luckily, as the vehicle approached, we got a much better look at the occupants. An old couple. The husband looked like an old lumberjack type. Definitely he could take care of himself. They slowed down as they approached and rolled down the window. The man asked if everything was okay and if we were lost or something. I said no, we know how to get back to the main highway from here. I told them about what happened back there, and he didn't even seem fazed. He said we shouldn't be out here alone. There's been many stories. I didn't ask any further. He then said that he never comes out without his rifle and his Nam knife. I'm assuming he means Vietnam. Anyway, we thanked them and got the hell out of there, never to return. I was hiking the Appalachian Trail northbound in early August, a few years ago. I was a day out of Davenport Gap, heading to Hot Springs, North Carolina. I don't remember the exact shelter I was at, but I know it was north of Max Patch. That time of year there aren't many people on the trail, and other than a couple of cars, I hadn't seen or spoken to another person in a full day. I decided to end my hike for the day at around 7 p.m. so I could eat dinner and prepare for bed before dark. I was also filming a little diary of my hike as a gift for my sister. I ate, filmed, reloaded on my water, and hit the hay right as it got dark and all the crickets started to come out. At about 2:30, I was startled awake, but not by a noise, rather by the absolute silence around me. I didn't hear the toads, crickets, or owls that you'd expect to hear at that time of night. The sounds I'd been hearing when I'd gone to sleep just 6 hours earlier. I looked around, but I couldn't see anything. Everything was perfectly still. I made the decision that I had to get the fuck out of there. I packed all my gear in about 5 minutes, threw on my headlamp, grabbed my bear bag, and noped my way up the trail. I'm pretty sure I averaged 4 miles per hour in the pitch black until sunrise. Because of such an early departure, I finished my planned 18 miles into Hot Springs by 10 a.m., which was kind of nice. To this day, I have no idea what was there that morning, but I know something was there. I've encountered tons of predators in the woods, everything from black bears to coyotes, but I've never experienced a calm like that before. That sort of thing only occurs when there's a large predator nearby, or even worse, a crazy person. Who knows what would have happened if I had stayed until sunrise? Maybe nothing, but I don't think it was worth sticking around to find out. This will probably get buried, but 2 years ago, myself and 2 other people were camping in Yellow Bottom, which is in the Cascades of Oregon. About 3 a.m. I woke up, hearing what sounded like a bunch of people having a campfire party. It was nothing huge, not even scary really, just a bunch of talking, laughing, stuff like that. I was kind of pissed off, since we'd specifically come up to get away from the college kids and such. Now, those very kids had set up camp what sounded like no less than 100 yards away. I couldn't see fire or light through the tent walls, and since that was my big concern, a fire in the woods, I just kind of ground my teeth about it and went back to sleep. About an hour later, I woke up again. This time, somebody let a little kid start crying. This was getting seriously annoying. It was not wailing, but sniffles. The kind of long-term crying a real small kid would do. I listened for about 5 minutes. Since I'm not a monster, I started to get this prickly feeling that maybe something was really wrong. You know, there was this little kid crying all alone. Where the hell were their parents? I started to get up, and my friend, who I thought was sleeping, grabbed my arm, just about giving me a heart attack. "Don't go out there, just wait." He knows the woods way better than me, and he sounded actually scared, so I sat there and waited. Yeah. A few minutes later, the crying stops, and the party starts right back up. But the weird thing was, now I couldn't really pinpoint what direction the party was coming from. I was trying to tell if maybe a group had found the kid or something and they were all talking together, but no matter what I tried, I couldn't pinpoint the direction. This party went on for another hour, just until the break of dawn, when all of a sudden nothing. The sounds literally cut off in the middle of a laugh. Now there was silence. I was completely freaked out. I think I might have even made a noise when it just stopped like that. My friend, who hadn't even gotten up the entire time, just said, "Stick Indians," then rolled over and fell back asleep. I got up when the sun was finally completely up and made some coffee. I looked around, but I'm not brave like that and didn't go that far. I searched the area where the sounds had come from though, definitely. There was nothing there. No signs of a campfire, no tents I could see through the trees, nothing. We packed up that day and I asked him what a stick Indian was. He wouldn't tell me. I had to come back and Google it. Even now, I'm not really sure what it's supposed to be. If you look it up, apparently it's some kind of forest spirit that lures people out by making noises like babies crying or people having a party, and then, I don't know, eats them or something. Fuck if I know. So that's my creepy story in the woods. I don't really have any proof like recordings or anything, but people who know the Pacific Northwest, it was way up in Yellow Bottom, past the official camps, on the left-hand fork of the main road, down a logging road and right by the river. The campsite with huge fallen over dead trees, that one. So if you want to try yourself, you can go out there, I suppose. I've never been back up there though. No sir, not for me. So my father and I were up there with his girlfriend and her 2 kids in a cabin out in the woods. It was late afternoon, and the door was open because it was a nice day. Since my father's girlfriend Kathy was making some delicious smelling enchiladas, in hindsight that was probably a dumb idea. We sit down to eat dinner together, when all of a sudden in walks a goddamn bear. Cue lots of screaming from us kids, as everyone leapt to their feet. Kathy was the only one to act really. She grabbed her chair like a lion tamer and screamed at the bear as she advanced towards it. The bear was just kinda like, "Ah, shit, what the fuck?" and backed up out of the cabin onto the porch, which is when Kathy slammed the door shut and locked it in its face. The bear skulked around our property for about an hour though. We watched it through the windows as it lumbered around to where my dad had napped earlier in the day. It began to gnaw on and maul his pillow, all while my dad stood there freaking out. My dad is a big, burly, no-nonsense kind of guy, but this scared even him. And that's my scary bear story. Fuck man, bears don't even knock. I was hunting a big field for whitetail. It was public land and I decided not to set up a tree stand, instead just sitting behind some heavy cover on the ground. I tried to get my spots well before the sun was up, so I was not making noise at first light when many deer start to move around. I got to my spot at about 5 a.m. It was absolutely pitch black, and all I had for light was my headlamp. After I switched it off, it was quiet for about 30 seconds when I suddenly heard a howling from my right side. It was clear that the howl had come from the edge of the field I was in, roughly 200 yards away. It sent shivers down my spine. 30 seconds passed, and I heard a second howl in the opposite direction, on the other side of the field. At this point, I was pretty freaked out, but I figured it was highly unlikely anything would attack me. Not much longer though, when from directly behind me, somewhere in the thick of the woods, there was a third howl. I was completely surrounded, and I was terrified. My truck was about 500 yards away to my left. It was along the edge of the woods in the field, and down a narrow path that cut right through them. I flicked on my headlamp, and flipped the safety off of my gun. I equipped my hunting knife as well, and started to move as fast as I could. I made it back to my vehicle. I waited until the sun came up before I went back and actually tried some hunting. I never saw a deer that entire weekend though. I presume that whatever was doing that howling drove the deer away, and I don't really blame those deer one bit. The entire experience was very scary, and I've done a lot of hunting and camping. I've spent a lot of time in the woods, both during the day and night. and nothing has ever freaked me out that bad. For reference, I'm a 20-year-old male who weighs about 200 pounds. I live in a suburban area of a very large city, which I won't disclose here. If I did, it would make it extremely easy to figure out where I live, based on context clues. This experience happened to me about 2 weeks ago, and I'm still real shaken up from it. I worked as a busboy on the weekends at a popular catering home near where I lived. I've been working there for a little over a month now. It was actually my last day, since I had another job lined up that was offering me more hours, with better pay as well. All I had to do was be available to work on weekends. I had to work a party that lasted from 7 p.m. until midnight, and I had to stay for almost 2 hours after it ended too, to reset the room for the following morning. At around 2 o'clock or so, we'd finished up resetting the room, and were told we could finally leave. I was about to walk out the building when my boss suddenly ran over to me and asked if I could help her move a table to the upstairs room. I didn't mind, so I agreed. We placed the table where it needed to go, and then we both went back downstairs. As we walked outside, we said goodnight to each other, as she got into her Uber that she'd requested to take her home. Now, due to numerous setbacks in my life, I unfortunately do not have my driver's license. The catering hall is about a 30 to 40 minute walk away from my house, and I didn't mind walking that far. During my time working there, my parents had been nice enough to drive me to and from work. My mom had told me to call her when I got off as usual, and she would give me a lift home. She didn't want me walking by myself that late at night. Well, I gave her a call on her phone, and immediately it went to voicemail, indicating her phone was off. I tried again, and the same thing happened. I thought to myself that she must have fallen asleep while waiting, and forgot to put her phone on the charger again. It must have died. I called my dad, hoping his phone was not silent, as it usually was when he goes to sleep. As my luck would have it, it must have been, since I called his phone a fair few times and got no answer. Well, fuck, I thought to myself. All my coworkers had already left, and I couldn't ask anyone I worked with for a ride home. The only bus nearby that would cut my trip in half stopped running at midnight, so I couldn't take the bus now either. I also didn't call an Uber. I'd forgotten my debit card at home. I only had 2 singles on me. Needless to say, it looked like I was gonna have to walk home. To give you some perspective, the catering hall was located in between a service road that runs along a major highway and a street that rides along the coast. In order to get home, I had to walk down the service road for about 10 minutes until I hit the aforementioned coast side road, which went underneath the highway. Then I would have to walk 2 more blocks up that road until I hit another street. Then I had to turn right, walk for another 10 minutes, half of which was spent walking uphill, until I reached the street that entered the community I lived in. I began the tiring walk, and about 5 minutes later, I'd passed the bar. I saw a car idling in the parking lot, with only the left headlight shining. The car was a white Toyota Camry. That's if I'm not mistaken. I'm not an expert on cars. There were 2 guys in the car smoking a cigarette. I quickly glanced over while passing by. I didn't really think much of what I saw. The bar closed at 1 in the morning, but I figured these guys had just pulled into the lot for a quick smoke while driving. I turned onto the road that runs underneath the highway and was crossing the service road on the other side when I suddenly got the urge to look behind me. I quickly looked back to see the same car driving down the road I was walking along. It wasn't exactly pitch black, but it was still relatively dark enough to where I might not have even recognized the car if both headlights had been shining. I continued walking and eventually turned right onto the road with the hill I mentioned earlier. They slowed down next to me, and the passenger rolled down the window to say something to me. The road I had turned onto was even darker than the road I was walking on before, so I wasn't able to make out what either of the people in the car looked like. From what I could make out, they were both probably in their late 20s and wearing dark concealing clothing. The driver appeared to be a white male, and the passenger looked like a black guy. The passenger called out to me, "Hey, what are you doing walking so late at night?" I responded that I was walking home from work. He then asked me if I would like them to give me a ride home. I responded by saying that was very kind of them, but I was fine walking by myself. Thank you for the offer, though. The man got visibly annoyed and appeared to be somewhat agitated. "Nah, man, it's dark and dangerous out here. You should let us give you a ride home. We'll get you there safe and sound. Come on, you can trust us." At this point, the only things on the road were the car and myself. I declined once again and darted behind the car to walk across the street. I walked up and turned left into the parking lot of a different community. It was about 2 blocks away from my own. It had a chain in front of it preventing people without a proper key from parking inside. All of a sudden, the driver rolled down the window. "Get the fuck back here, you little shit!" He did a U-turn and pulled up to the entrance of the lot. The passenger jumped out and began to chase me on foot. The driver peeled off after, presumably to get onto the road on the other side and try to ambush me. Needless to say, my adrenaline immediately started spiking. I began sprinting away from this crazy man. "Stop! We're gonna give you a ride. Stop running away from us." I looked back and we had a fair distance between us. Now that I got a closer look, he was somewhat chubby and probably had not been expecting me to be able to run so fast, since I was slightly overweight myself. I turned onto the road and continued sprinting until I heard a car squealing down the road behind me. I looked back to see a single headlight in the distance, speeding down the road, and the man chasing after me starting to gain on me. I started freaking out. I ran and turned another left, making a break for the park, since the area of the park I was running towards was dark and thick with trees. I figured I could lose them. As I ran into the park, struggling to continue sprinting, I was losing my breath. I looked back to see the car turn down the road. The driver stopped in place and yelled at his friend. "Hey man, get back in the car. The cops hang out back there. They might see us. Leave him. We're getting out of there." The man chasing me stopped immediately and ran back towards the car. He flung the door open and jumped in. As soon as he slammed it closed, the driver did a pinpoint U-turn and sped off right onto the road up ahead. Then they disappeared. The park was extremely large. I remember my parents talking about a good number of drug deals taking place there, and that the police were starting to send officers to patrol the area at night to bust up any drug deals they witnessed. That must have been what spooked my pursuers away. I jogged quickly into the park and hid in the darkness beneath the trees for about 20 minutes or so, just to be sure they were definitely gone. I tried to calm myself down as much as I could after. I walked through the park towards the exit and to my community. My senses were on hyper alert. For all I knew, there could have been some other weirdo lurking around in the dark just waiting for me. Thankfully, I made it to my house just fine. I quickly unlocked the door. I walked into the living room to my dog greeting me. I looked to my right to see my mom, of course, passed out on the couch, with the TV still on just as I'd thought. I walked into my own room and flopped onto my bed, exhausted both physically and emotionally. I was relieved I had gotten away from those 2 guys. I had never been happier to be in the safety of my own home. I always knew it was dangerous to walk alone at night. Usually I don't. I had hoped that the one time I did, it would be okay. Clearly, I had been proven wrong. I woke up around noon the next day and walked into the living room to say hello to my parents. Now, my mom got up and hugged me, apologizing profusely for falling asleep when she said she'd pick me up. She said she had woken up around 5 in the morning and freaked out that she'd fallen asleep, that something bad might have happened to me. She rushed into my room to see me sound asleep and was really relieved that I had gotten home safely. I didn't say anything about what happened on my walk home that night. I knew it would devastate my parents to hear they'd almost lost their son. My mom would have never been able to live with the guilt. She could have prevented the whole encounter just by staying awake to come pick me up. I didn't really blame her though. I never actually told anyone except for a close friend of mine about this experience. I have no idea why those guys singled me out like that, but I knew for a fact they were up to no good. I don't think I ever want to find out what they were up to. I'm glad I'm safe and sound. Cody, Wyoming, midnight. I just finished a very long day at work. I'm a medical courier, and I'm regularly on the road staying in hotels. Life is never dull. This particular evening, I wound up in a 500-mile drive that ended in Cody, Wyoming. Like I said, it was around midnight. It was very cold. It was in December after all, and this was Wyoming. The roads had been very so-so that night. They weren't clear, but they weren't as treacherous as usual. It was one of those drives in the dark where you're on edge the whole time. Staying alert for 500 miles on dark roads that were nearly abandoned, especially at this time of night, with light snow and heavy winds, it really takes a lot out of a person. This particular week had been very busy too. I had been to 4 different states that week by the time I reached Wyoming that evening. The drive to the patient's house was up a windy, slick road. Luckily, it was fairly uneventful. After I had dropped off the medicine to them, I called my boss to let them know I'd made the delivery successfully and was heading to a hotel to get some sleep. It was the usual conversation. We talked briefly about how much they would reimburse me for the hotel room. They always say $80 to $100. It's pretty typical and fair, since a cheap hotel in Cody, Wyoming is about that price. I'm 31 though, so a good night's rest, a good free breakfast, and a nice AM soak in the hot tub are requirements for me whenever I catch myself in a hotel room away from home. I mean, by the time I got to the hotel, I'd have put some pretty damn serious miles on there. So I decided to treat myself. If I'm staying in a hotel, it has to be a good one. I can afford to treat myself just a little bit after such hard work. I feel a lot better after a good night's rest, a great breakfast, and a nice soak. I won't name the chain of hotels I stay at, but I usually frequent one chain because it's the best value in my hometown, which is back in Nebraska. This night, I pulled into the hotel, which I had stayed at 4 times now, so I was quite familiar with the place. I had called ahead about 8 hours before when I was leaving Denver to book a room for myself and let them know they would be expecting me at midnight. I walked in with my bag, dusting off the snow that had fallen on me while I was getting my stuff out of the car. It was very quiet inside. There was no music, and the TV wasn't on in the lobby either. I wandered to the counter, leaving a trail of wet shoe prints behind me from coming in out of the snow. My shoes were squeaking as I approached, but when I got to the counter, there was no one there. On the counter was a bowl of ice cream with a brownie from a restaurant connected to the hotel. The local paper was open to the comics page, and the Sudoku was half filled out, with the pen still there. Hanging on the back of the chair was a small lady's coat, with a fake fur fringe around the hood. On the floor next to the chairs were a pair of smaller pink and black Nikes and a black purse as well. I figured by the assumption of the coat, shoes, and purse that whoever was supposed to man the desk must have been in the bathroom. I stood at the counter quietly waiting on her to return. I fiddled with my wallet a bit, getting out my card to pay for everything. I scrolled down through my phone and hooked up to the free Wi-Fi. 5 minutes go by, then 10, then 15. The phone started ringing. I had no idea where she could be. I had begun to get irritated. It had been a long day, and I wanted to get rested before I had to get up and drive home in the morning. After the phone stopped ringing, I began to wander around the lobby and behind the counter. "Hello? Is anyone there?" I shouted as loudly as possible. The area further behind the counter was an employees-only area. I ventured back there, where a hallway led to the back of the house area, connected to the offices, staff elevator, bathrooms, laundry, and the restaurant. I ventured down this hallway, still calling out. No one answered. It was now 12:30. As I returned to the counter and began looking for a posted phone number for a manager or someone of authority to report this strange going on, the phone rang again. The cordless phone was laying next to the paper the person manning the desk had opened. Frustrated and exhausted, I answered the phone, hoping it was someone who could tell me where the woman is who was supposed to be checking me in. It wasn't. It was another guest who had tried calling in multiple times for a wake-up call in the morning. I explained to the gentleman on the phone my situation and how I couldn't help him. He stated he was coming down as well. We were going to look for the girl who was supposed to man the counter together. I had not found a number to call for a manager. 5 minutes went by and an older man with some odd glasses and long unkempt hair came into the lobby from the first floor hallway. At this point, I had been behind the counter for a fair bit and had been shouting to the point I feared I may wake everyone up. I had wandered through the back area, the lobby, the front part of the restaurant, all while shouting. There was no one there. This guy who had just appeared was kind of giving me the creeps. I was exhausted and on high alert. The employee was missing, and this creepy-looking guy had just happened to appear at the same time. Feeling a bit nervous about this gentleman, I stayed prepared for any strange behavior and kept myself at least an arm's distance from him. I explained where I had looked. I began to go through what I called the worst-case scenario preparation. This looked like a guy who could have easily overpowered a small woman. I may be standing here with a crazy person. I kept my space and my back towards the main entry just in case. I had no reason to believe I was in immediate trouble, but something about the way this guy was looking at me and the area was really freaking me out. It was at this point I debated on calling the cops. It was now 12:45 a.m. The gentleman told me that maybe she was in the bathroom. I responded that I had thought that myself, but I'd walked by and called out to see if she needed help, and nobody answered. He insisted that we go check the women's bathrooms ourselves. A red flag went off immediately. I put another foot or two of space between us as I let him lead us down the hallway to the employee bathroom. My heart and mind were racing. Did this guy kill her or something? Was he leading me back here to try and kill me too? I started to worry about my safety. As we went down the hallway that led to small rooms with one exit in and out, we reached the bathroom. He knocks and announces himself, then forces his way inside. Bathroom was empty. We checked a few more rooms and the elevator, but we didn't find anyone. We ventured back to the lobby, where I still tried to look for any phone number that could be a manager or a supervisor. After another 10 minutes, I finally found it. Someone answered. It was now 12:55 a.m. The half-asleep voice on the other end of the phone was the maintenance woman for the hotel, confused as to who I am and why I was calling her. I explained the situation as the creepy man stood on the other side of the counter, now giving me a cold glare. The maintenance woman said she would be there in 10 minutes or so. I hung up the phone and walked around, still confused. The woman who was supposed to be there had just left all her stuff, as if she'd vanished altogether. It was at this point I decided to wander towards the lobby and the seating area for the restaurant. Once in the door, I turned the corner. I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. Down at the end of the booths, there were a pair of legs just barely hanging out of one of them. I had walked within 15 feet of there while checking around before the creepy guy had showed up. Although I hadn't noticed before, I could now clearly see legs hanging out. Instantly, the pit of my stomach turned sour, and a sense of dread came over me. The creepy guy got right up by me. Thinking the worst, I took a few steps away from him and down the row of booths. I was in this dark restaurant with him at the other end. I cautiously approached the booth where the woman was laying. She was about 20 years old and very pretty. I tapped her foot, but she didn't respond. I shook her again, trying to get her attention. No response. At this moment, the creepy guy started to walk down towards me. I started to feel I may need to defend myself. I knelt down to draw from my ankle holster as the man began to quickly move towards me. It was at this exact moment that the girl decided to wake up and kick me in the chest, knocking me down and stopping the creepy man in his tracks. Apparently, she had been really deeply asleep. Mr. Creepy Guy was just a guest. Sorry, man. Moments later, the maintenance woman arrived, and by 1:15 a.m., I was in my room trying to decompress from that stressful-ass experience. I really thought I was alone in there with a killer or something. I've never spoken on this, not even to my parents or anyone around me. I'm a 22-year-old male, and this happened when I was 14, all the way through the age of 15. My friends and I would always hang out at the local mall during our free time. One day, I had arrived a bit earlier than my friends and was waiting at a seating area in the food court. There were a couple of couches around each other, and it was a common area for anyone to come and sit. I didn't really notice much when a man came over and sat down at a couch across from me. I was sitting on my phone, not paying attention, until he spoke up and said something along the lines of, "Do you come here often?" I looked up to see a man who was in his late 50s to early 60s. I told him I often did with my friends, and he then introduced himself. I still remember his first name, as it was exactly the same as my dad's. I didn't get any initial weird feelings. The man seemed normal enough, and I had no reason to be weirded out by him. I told him my name, and we started making small talk. I'm a fairly sociable person and have been since a young age, so I was fine with talking to what I assumed was just a kind older man wanting to chat with someone. He started asking me about the things I like to do. I said I enjoyed going to the local lake and fishing and swimming, to which he said he went out to the same area every weekend and enjoyed the same things as well. I said I enjoyed making music. He said he liked making music also. I told him I was an avid piano player, and he excitingly told me he had a piano at his house. As I started to say more things, to each and every one he replied he enjoyed doing them also. It felt normal at first, but as we kept talking, I kept getting a weirder and weirder feeling. It was like every single thing he said was trying to prove something to me and win me over. He said he had a boat at the lake and we should go sometime together. He even said he lived right across the street from the mall and that I was welcome to stop by and play his piano. Even going as far as to tell me the complex he lived in and how to get there from the mall. He said if I'd like to go over that same day and play his piano, I was more than welcome to. With every passing minute, he was pressing harder and harder for me to come hang out with him. Talking with him honestly started to give me the weirdest primitive instinct feeling ever, like I was staring at the face of evil or bad intentions. After 5 to 10 minutes of talking with him, I lied and said my friends had now arrived, and I was going to go find them. He somewhat sadly said okay and wished me well. A couple of weeks go by, and my friends and I go to the mall once again. We were all walking through, when out of the corner of my eye, I see the exact same man. He had his hoodie pulled down covering his face and was walking past us in the opposite direction. We locked eyes for a split second, and my heart immediately dropped. I didn't look back though, and honestly forgot about it soon after. For the next 2 months or so though, I would keep seeing him randomly appearing at the mall. I kept brushing it off as a coincidence. There are definitely regulars there who come very often. I really didn't think too much of seeing him, as he'd never tried to approach me since the first day. Occasionally though, I'd look over and see him, and he'd be staring at me. I was very naive. I always got a semi-weird feeling anytime I saw him, but I always just brushed it off. That was until one day. I went to the mall with my friends like usual. and we hung out for a few hours before all leaving and going home our separate ways. I got home and went into my room. No one else was home with me, and I would be by myself for a couple of hours. My mom gets home around 7 to 8 p.m. and comes into my room looking somewhat worried, asking if I'd noticed a man outside. I said no, and she then showed me her phone. We have 2 cameras, one in the front of the house and one in the back. About 20 minutes after I'd gotten home, someone sneakily approached our house. We lived off a very busy street, and our front wall blocks a majority of the view in. We did not see a car park or anything, just a random man walking up to our house from the street. The camera was located near our front door looking out to the driveway, so as the man got closer, I realized it was the same guy I had been seeing at the mall. I immediately felt sick to my stomach. He came and looked through the front door glass. He walked over to the side of our house near our driveway and left the view of the camera. I remember there was nothing on the back camera either, so he must have stayed by the side of our house for quite a while. My room was not located over there, so I have no idea what he could have been doing. He then came back around after a while and looked through the front door again before walking away. I don't know if I was just too embarrassed or scared to say anything, but I said I didn't notice and didn't even know who it was. My mom found it weird he was looking into our house, but said it could have been a homeless guy or a druggie. We did live off a busy street with a bus stop right in front of our house. I just went with that. My dad added more security cameras after this to deter people, and I never admitted to seeing him before. After he showed up to my house, though, it was confirmed to me that he was following me around. I don't know what his intentions were, but he never came back to the house. We moved to a different part of the city not long after, and it was too far to go to that mall again. I've not seen him ever since, and I wish to never do so again. To the best of my memory, it was the late 80s, on a hot and sunny day in Toronto, Canada. I was about 12 years old. My friends and I were playing baseball at a public school baseball diamond, which was on a relatively busy street. Just for reference, this school has since been demolished, and a new school building was built right over said baseball diamond. A new building with the exact same name. Also, interesting random fact, the old school building happens to be the location where country singer Michelle Wright did her music video for All I Really Wanna Do. Now, back to the story. A man in his 40s walked up and sat on the bench right beside the baseball diamond, right underneath the hot sun. No hat, nor any other kind of shade. We thought this was a little bit odd, but we kept playing anyway. He was watching us and would shout some comments pertaining to baseball here and there. I suppose he was quite bored and had nothing better to do. Let's call him man number 1. The baseball diamond was right beside the busy street, which had its share of poor people, middle-class people, drug addicts, drug dealers, prostitutes, and other weirdos. Needless to say, we were pretty used to random stuff going on around us. As the man kept shouting, though, his uninvited baseball comments began to really annoy me. At this point, I qualified him as creepy. To my relief, he eventually walked away. Soon, it was my turn to pitch. Just then, another man showed up, also in his 40s. Let's call him man number 2. Number 2 also had some comments on our baseball game. He was much more aggressive in his advice, though. Eventually, he came closer and closer until he stepped right up to me and started giving me pitching advice. I thought it was strange that he was so enthusiastic about this, but as a naive young boy, I had the habit of respecting and obeying adults by default. He started getting right up against my path and holding my wrist to show me how to pitch. You know, how you see in the movies, how the guy puts moves on the girls under the guise of teaching them something, like throwing a ball or swinging a golf club. Yeah, He was doing that to me. Now that I think about it, he was right up against my body, too. It was quite inappropriate, to say the least. I was starting to get very uncomfortable. What made it even worse is I could smell the alcohol lingering on him, as he was touching me inappropriately in front of all my friends in broad daylight. I didn't know what to do. I don't know what my friends were thinking, but I remember it being very quiet. I suppose they were in a bit of shock as well. Not as much as I was, though. I think it's just a thing kids have to please people, especially adults. Kinda reminds me of that movie The Lovely Bones, where the predator uses kids' respect for adults against them, manipulating them. When I finally came over my initial shock, I backed away. Just then, I heard man number 1 shouting some obscenities at man number 2. Man number 1 had returned. He came right at the other guy and started shoving him around. Man number 2 started to back away, cursing back at man number 1, who was still scolding and cursing at him as well. He did some sort of flying kick into his back and sent him stumbling forward. This continued as their now fight moved out of the schoolyard. We watched them for a few minutes until man number 2 relented and disappeared. Man number 1 returned looking quite angry and shouted a few things to us. To be honest, I was still in shock and didn't understand what he was saying though. Finally, he walked away for good this time. Even though I was a little scrapper kid, for years thinking back on it, I felt foolish, violated, ashamed for letting someone put his hands on me like that. I realized later on that I must be grateful to that stranger, man number 1, who had nothing better to do that day than sit in the sun shouting uninvited baseball comments at kids, but returned anyway to beat up and chase away a sexual predator trying to prey on a child. Whoever you are, I thank you. And to everyone else, please let kids know they aren't obligated to please or be polite to anyone that makes them feel uncomfortable in any way. They don't owe them anything. Encourage them to be strong and stand up for themselves. I'm a 29-year-old female. Call me Mary. I worked in a mental health and psychiatric ward in a hospital for about 7 years before I resigned last year. It can be really grueling, but it's ultimately rewarding work. I mostly conduct individualized therapy for inpatients who don't respond to outpatient or group therapy well. I advocate for their needs and am able to make real connections with people who sometimes just need some extra support. It's really opened my eyes to the scope of the human condition. Forgive me if that sounds a bit pretentious, and what others' lives are like besides my own. Every once in a while, though, I get someone in my ward that I don't have the qualifications to treat. Not for lack of trying, mind you. Sometimes they just don't click with anyone in our facility. And that's just the state of things. You just do the best you can to help them adjust until they find someone they can open up to. There was one patient who transferred into my care, though, that I genuinely grew to fear despite my efforts to keep up an empathetic professional front. Barring names, the patient was transferred to the mental health ward during my last year there. He was in his 30s and really thin. According to his primary doctors, he had stopped eating because he was convinced his wife of 5 years was trying to poison him. He began to get belligerent and borderline violent with the wife, swearing at her if he thought she was behaving suspiciously. At first, he was admitted to the ICU because of his poor health. But after a few weeks, he got approval for referral upstairs to psychiatric. That's where I came in. Our first few sessions, I would do most of the talking. He was very quiet and withdrawn, but he seemed to acknowledge that maybe he was wrong about his wife, which was a start to me. I asked him why he thought his wife was trying to poison him in the first place. He said the suspicion had started when she went out of the room to pour him a drink rather than just bringing the bottle right in. He said she had told him the bottle was almost out anyway, and she saw no point in bringing it all the way over only to immediately throw it away. but he didn't believe her. He gradually opened up a bit more from there. He said they'd been having some problems prior to his beliefs. They had separated for a few months before the first incident, and he often described her as looking at him with what he described as bitchy contempt. Like she was pissed at him, but he didn't even know what he'd done wrong. I thought we were making some good progress. I reminded him that each incident of his wife trying to poison him had a rational explanation, and let him work out the reasons for himself with some gentle guidance. That was when the first accusation came up. He sat across from me in my client chair one day. There was a desk between us, and I felt good knowing there was some sort of barrier there. He suddenly grew quiet in a moment where we were talking about another incident with his wife, something involving his birthday cake. He sternly said, "Are you with that bitch?" "Excuse me?" I said out of reflex. Every bit of conflict training rushed through my head as I recomposed myself. I cleared my throat. "I apologize, but what exactly do you mean by that?" I could see the veins bulging out of his neck as he narrowed his eyes at me. His voice was low and nearly a growl now. "You're with that bitch, aren't you? My wife. You're trying to get in my head so next time I'll eat what she gives me, right? Don't deny it." "I don't know your wife," I said gently. "Now, how about we take a moment?" And he suddenly slammed his fist down on the desk. "No! No! You're trying to poison me too! Don't talk to me!" He seemed like a completely different person from when I met him. He started spitting and swearing, leading security to be called in. They had to sedate him to take him back to his room. All the while, I was pushed back against the window to my own office, unable to move and completely rattled. My hand shook as he was dragged out of the room. I felt like I was in the sights of someone who genuinely wanted to hurt me or possibly kill me. Although he didn't get the opportunity to physically harm me, I was pretty sure he really wanted to. He'd been supplied with nutrient supplements that had returned him to his former strength, and I'm very small, so he would have had no problem tossing me around the room like a rag doll if he wanted to. I was offered the rest of the day off, which I gratefully took to process these events. I needed a fresh mind to come back the next day and work with other patients. I didn't know how I would deal with this guy going forward, especially if he felt he couldn't trust me anymore, but I decided to cross that bridge when I came to it. The next day, the patient was brought in. He wanted to apologize and said his wife had baked me a cake for taking care of him. Now, I'm not allowed to accept any food items from patients or outside family members, so I said I was grateful, but I had to politely decline. He immediately became irate, asking in an angry tone, "Why won't you eat it, huh?" This caught me off guard. For one, he was being treated for a possible delusion that his wife was trying to poison him. For two, it was strange he trusted his wife with any sort of food at this stage. For three, he'd just accused me the day prior of working with his wife to try and kill him too. So this sudden turnaround was very startling. He became very insistent. "Just eat the fucking cake," he said over and over, to the point where security had to be called again to escort him out. He was released from my care soon after, for fear of my safety. I don't know what's happened to him since. My boss and a police officer called to the scene suspected that he'd put something into the cake his wife had given him, either to support his delusion or to specifically target me. Which possibility is correct, I'll never know. I resigned a few weeks later for a different, less stressful career option. To anyone who works in psychiatric, be real careful out there. When I was 13, I was completely in love with the girl next door. Her name was Catherine, and she also happened to be my best friend. We would spend the night at each other's houses as kids all the time. Watch movies, paint our nails. It was in my first year of high school that I started to feel differently about her. Don't get me wrong, I'd always loved her, of course, but it started to feel more intense. I started thinking about her more often, and every time I saw her, I would notice more and more how pretty she was. She had bright blue eyes and dirty blonde hair, and her smile caused my heart to skip a beat. I was so scared to confess to her though. For one thing, I didn't know if she felt the same way or if she was gay at all. The topic just never came up, as we were too busy fangirling over bands we liked or new movies coming out. The last thing I wanted to do was mess up our lifelong friendship at that point. However, the second problem was bigger and more concerning. We lived in a really conservative area that still held on to those traditional values. I knew that going public, especially at the time with my feelings, would be at the very least frowned upon. So, for the longest time, I hid in the shadows while being by her side every day through high school. We still hung out every weekend and after school a few times a week, driving through town and telling each other all our secrets. We still shared a blanket on movie night, though now my heart would leap whenever she threw her arms around me because of a big jump scare or romantic moment. She really trusted me completely with her biggest fears and worries, and so did I with her, minus that one really big thing. As graduation was rapidly approaching, and the air was growing warmer with each passing day, I noticed that her affection toward me had been heating up too. I don't know if it was just my imagination running wild, but she began to hug me for a lot longer and told me I was pretty a lot more often too. On the night of our senior prom, I took her aside. We'd gone with a group of friends, so there were no dates involved. I worked up the courage and stole a kiss. To my disbelief and happiness, she simply said, "I was waiting for you to do that, you know." We started a secret relationship from that night on. We still kept our usual dynamic with movie nights and boy bands and whatever hobbies we had, but without going into detail, I didn't think I could be happier. I loved her and she loved me. We knew we'd go to the same college together, and I honestly couldn't wait to get out of this town. I know it sounds like naive and wishful thinking, but I honestly thought I was going to marry Catherine someday. One day in late August though, a couple of weeks before we were set to pack for school, Catherine just stopped talking to me. I couldn't reach her on cell, and whenever I called her house, her dad would always answer and say something along the lines of, "Oh, Catherine is out right now. I'll have her call you back later." Her window faced mine on the side of the house, so after the second day of her not calling me back, I knew that something was wrong. I tried to get a peek in her window to see if she was there, but the curtains were drawn shut and her bedroom light was turned off as well. She usually kept her light on until midnight, as she was a night owl. By that point, I was starting to get really worried. I started searching every place I knew she could be. The candy shop, the lake, all the country roads leading out into the woods. I asked her coworkers at the local Hannaford if they'd seen her recently, and they all shook her head no. She hadn't shown up for work 3 days in a row, and that certainly was not like her. Catherine was hardworking, driven, and always called if she was going to be late or wasn't coming in. She'd always call me, too. That was when I finally broke down. I went to knock on her door, determined to find out what was going on. I stood on the front stoop, my shoulders slumped and eyes pricking with tears. My entire body was tense and wired, as if I hadn't slept in a week. I was about ready to burst through the doorway when she answered, and hug her and ask her where the hell she'd been, if she answered. And so I knocked. Her dad opened the door, looking as if he'd just been in the middle of a nap. Catherine's dad had always been a little indifferent to me, never really talking to me whenever I came over, or when he had to pick her and I up from school. Today I could see a scowl of disgust plainly on his face. He regarded me coldly. Hello, is Kat here? I'm really worried about her and I need to talk to her." "I told you she was out," he snapped immediately. "And you need to stay away from her. I know all about your little love letters." What he said made my heart completely stop. How did he know about those? I'd written these letters a month into our relationship that detailed how long I was in love with her. She hid them deep inside her dresser. He'd gotten them somehow. He must have done something to her. Kicked her out of the house or worse. Maybe she ran away. I gasped and couldn't speak. but he did. "She's gone. You won't see my daughter again, so don't even try." With those final crushing words, he slammed the door in my face. I jumped back, almost falling down. My hands were shaking. I was in disbelief. Resigned and with tears streaming down my face, I went home to face the disappointment of my parents. Apparently, her dad had also let them know what was going on all along. I never saw Catherine again. My best friend, the girl I grew up with and my first love, disappeared from my life forever. I did, however, eventually find out what happened to her from sources I won't name. After her father snooped through her room and found my letters, he snapped. He locked her in her room that night, where she stayed for 2 days while he arranged a ride from a friend to take her to someplace where they would cure her affliction. I'm disgusted to even think about what that means and what she went through. I'm out of my oppressive hometown and married to a wonderful woman now. Some part of me always still breaks, though, whenever Catherine crosses my mind. I hope she's okay wherever she is, and even if we can't be in love anymore, I still want my best friend, the girl next door, back. She never did anything wrong. She never deserved what happened to her. This happened in October of 2014. I'm originally from a small town, but I moved into a larger area in the Midwest for grad school. When this happened, I'd rented a room and shared a house with other students near the university. It was an older 2-story house, with a 1-story extension in the back which served as our living room. When you walked through the front door, there was a staircase immediately to the left, which went up to a hallway that turned right. In the hall, there was a bathroom, and my room was at the very end. There were 2 other rooms on the right side as well. At the time, I had 3 roommates, a girl who lived across the hall and a guy who lived in the other room upstairs. There was also another guy in the downstairs area. All of them were usually gone on the weekends, though. On the night in question, I was dating my girlfriend for a little over a month. It was Saturday night, and I'd picked her up in my car. We went out, had a few drinks, and took an Uber home. I didn't feel comfortable driving. We got to the house and went immediately upstairs to my room. We were the only ones there. After me and my girlfriend had some intimate time together, we fell asleep. I'm a pretty heavy sleeper, but my girlfriend is not. All of a sudden, she nudged me awake to tell me she had heard a noise coming from outside. I told her it was probably just some drunk people walking by, since we lived so close to campus. Maybe it was a raccoon or some other small animal. She seemed satisfied with that explanation and tried to go back to sleep. Just then, though, we heard another noise coming from the back of the house. It didn't sound like people just walking by. This time, I got out of bed and walked over to one of my windows, which faced the area the noise was coming from directly. I had the curtains and blinds down. I peeked from around the corner and looked outside. My slight buzz and drowsiness went away immediately. My heart started racing like crazy after I looked outside and saw the silhouette of a person climbing onto the roof of the extension. My girlfriend saw my reaction and asked me what was wrong. I immediately told her to grab a phone and go to Jessica's room across the hall, lock the door and call 911 because there was an intruder climbing the roof of our house. My girlfriend did as she was told. I slipped on a pair of gym shorts and shoes and grabbed a kitchen knife that was on my desk, left over after eating some dinner and conveniently forgetting to clean it up the night before. How lucky for me. I stood next to the window with my back against the wall and listened in closely. I could hear the person walking along the roof, leaving light footsteps. Then I heard a noise. I could tell he was fidgeting with the bathroom window, which was right next to my room. Luckily, that window was already locked. I tiptoed outside my room into the hall, waiting to attack if he broke in through the window, knowing I had to protect my home and my girlfriend. I stopped hearing the noises coming from the bathroom window. Then I started to hear a similar noise coming from my window, the one I'd just been standing next to. My heart was pounding really hard now. I gripped the knife tight in my hand, mentally rehearsing on what I would do if they managed to break in. All of this occurred within just a few moments. I realized that maybe I could just scare the intruder away and avoid a confrontation completely. I took a deep breath and yelled, "I have a gun! Come inside and find out!" I heard the thud of footsteps going away from the window, and then the noise of gravel. I was sweating at this point. I walked outside my room and knocked on Jessica's door, telling my girlfriend it was me, and the intruder seemed to be gone. She unlocked the door and opened it. I saw she had been crying. I dropped the knife and hugged her. I told her everything was going to be okay. Just then, I saw the blue and red lights of the police outside the window of Jessica's room, which faced the front of the house. I told my girlfriend to come with me so we could tell the police what happened. I walked downstairs, turned on the porch light, and unlocked the door, opening it slowly with my hands held up. The police were approaching with their guns drawn, and saw me in nothing but shorts and shoes drenched in sweat. I kept my hands held up and told them I lived there, and the intruder had ran away out the back. The police officer said something into his radio, some code or something. He said the intruder was still on the loose. He stood there with us while the other officer walked inside the house. I was told he was going to check and make sure there was no one hiding inside or something. After what seemed like a long while, but was maybe only a few minutes, I heard a voice over the radio calling it all clear. We went inside, and one officer began to ask us questions, while the other poked around outside. After giving our statements, the other officer walked back in and told us it looked like the intruder had climbed on top of our garbage cans to get onto the roof. One of the cans was apparently tipped over. Since the house was dark and there was no light outside and no cars in the lot, we may have been victims of an attempted robbery. I asked the officer if there was any weapons they might have left behind in their startlement. He said no. It was unlikely the intruder wanted to harm anyone. There had been a series of break-ins during the last several weeks around campus, with the intruders mainly only taking prescription drugs. He advised me to get a better weapon than a steak knife for the future, and to keep the lights on inside and our windows locked, maybe consider installing outside lights. I asked if he could fingerprint the window, but he said he couldn't because nothing had been taken and no one was harmed. Most likely this person had been wearing gloves anyway. The police told us they would have units search the neighborhood, but it was unlikely they would find the person, since I couldn't give a description of them, having only seen a silhouette. Needless to say, my girlfriend and I did not get much sleep that night. The next day, I called my landlord and told him what happened. The following day, we had a bright light installed on our back patio that turned on when it got dark automatically. We also installed a motion light outside the window upstairs that shines brightly if anyone tries to stand on the roof. Not content on just threatening a burglar with a gun, I went out and actually bought one. I now keep it in my nightstand drawer beside my bed. Every year, my town does a haunted house during the week of Halloween. I had been going to it since I was very young, and I still do go to this day. There was one time, however, when I was much younger, that I had a really bad time at one. I was in middle school at the time. There was a bully named Richard who always gave me a really hard time. Normally, I was able to avoid him and never got into any serious problems with him. I could stay around adults most of the time, and he would never do anything to me when they were around. I was planning on going to the haunted house on Halloween Day, as I did every single year. It was really busy this season too. I always felt I had to go on Halloween. That just seemed way more authentic for whatever reason. I was 13 years old when this happened. We had school on that Halloween day. During my lunch period, I made a stop at my locker. When I did, a note fell out of it. I opened it up and realized it was from Richard. He told me that he would also be at the haunted house that night, and he would be the one to really scare me. I was nervous, but I wasn't really that worried. I mean, what could he possibly do to me in front of all the people that were going to be there? I had every reason to believe I would feel safe among that many people. It was dark by the time I got in line for the haunted house. It was just as busy as I thought it would be, too. I was a bit nervous and kept looking around for Richard. I didn't see him anywhere in the line, and like I mentioned, I didn't really think he would try anything in front of so many people. As the line grew longer and people kept going in and out of the haunted house, I still couldn't see him anywhere. I eventually decided the note must have been nothing more than him wanting to scare me. I went into the haunted house, and I was happy that they did everything so different each year. You could go through the house with your friends or by yourself. I didn't have anyone with me, so I decided to go it alone. I have to say, I was still a little bit on edge, but I was enjoying the house quite a bit. If anything, it actually enhanced the experience. I entered this room, and the door shut behind me. It was dark, but there was a strobe light in the room. It was empty except for a chair that was sitting in the corner, and there was a scarecrow sitting on that chair. The strobe light made the whole scene extra creepy, and I was absolutely nervous. I knew that someone was probably in the scarecrow costume and would get up and start creepily moving towards me. Then I would have to go to the other door and leave the room. Sure enough, the scarecrow got up and started moving towards me. With my heart pounding, I made my way to the door. Before I could get my hand on the knob, the scarecrow moved fast and grabbed me in a headlock. He pressed all his weight down on me, and I fell down to my knees. He was really strong. I heard Richard's voice whisper in my ear, "I told you I would be here." It hadn't even occurred to me to think he might have been working in the haunted house. By that point, I was really scared. I tried to call out to someone for help, but he had his arm around my neck. He was choking me, and I wasn't able to make much sound. I actually thought the guy was going to try and kill me. I had never been so scared in my life. I only wished I had convinced my family to come with me that time. I don't know how long it was, but it couldn't have been too long before the door opened. I realized the next people touring the house must have opened the door to the room. I was hoping they would pull Richard off me, but they didn't at first. I found out later they thought the scarecrow choking a person was supposed to be part of the haunted house. Fortunately, they recognized me as being the person in front of them in line. They were 3 high school guys. They pulled Richard off me, and I fell to the ground. One of them went and got another haunted house employee, while I laid there trying to recover my breath. This is further good news concerning this story too. I didn't have to put up with Richard any longer at school for quite a while. He got sent to juvie right after, and he deserved it. What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with, and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.